Welcome to the journey of transformation. We are in the third stage of our journey, loving God with all of our minds. And today we're in the third lesson of the third stage. And our lesson today is, what are you thinking about? We saw in the earlier study last time how the brain forms our mind by forming its thoughts, manners of thinking, our reasoning, our emotion, and how connections between millions of neurons form networks of pathways. And these pathways record our memory, the memory of the stories we tell ourselves over and over and over again. And these stories we tell ourselves that are recorded in the pathways of our brain serve us for different purposes. They can help us explain who we are. We tell ourselves stories to explain why we think the way we think, why we talk the way we do, or why we do what we do. Sometimes we use the stories we tell ourselves to justify ourselves and to defend ourselves. Jesus once spoke about the power of these stories in a principle that he described in Luke chapter 6, verse 45. We want to read that passage. We read it last time. We want to review it today. He says, "A good man brings good things out of the good stored up in his heart, and an evil man brings evil things out of the evil stored up in his heart. For the mouth speaks what the heart is full of." How do we store good things in our hearts? We store the stories that remind us about what is good. We treasure those stories, and they have the power to inspire us to do good, to bring forth good fruit in our life. We can also treasure bad stories, evil stories, and they can bring evil as the fruit of our life. And so, living a transformed life and renewing our mind means that we replace the bad stories with the good stories. For instance, if we're treasuring a story of retaliation and vengeance, for instance, we want to replace it with a good story of forgiveness, patience, and compassion towards somebody. And so we want to look at today the importance of renewing our minds by replacing these stories. But we're going to do so based on a passage of Scripture in Romans chapter 8, beginning with verse 5, where Paul talks about two different kinds of mentalities. I want you to read with me in Romans chapter 8 and verse 5 to verse 8. He says, "Those who live according to the flesh have their mind set on what the flesh desires. But those who live in accordance with the Spirit have their minds set on what the Spirit desires. The mind governed by the flesh is death, but the mind governed by the Spirit is life and peace. The mind governed by the flesh is hostile to God. It does not submit to God's law, nor can it do so. Those who are in the realm of the flesh cannot please God." Now here you see that Paul uses the word flesh a lot. We're going to find out what that refers to. But he's describing two kinds of minds, the mind of the flesh and the mind that's according to the Spirit, a mind that desires what the Spirit desires. And loving God requires us to renovate our minds, change our minds, transform them by replacing the mind of the flesh with the mind of the Spirit. So what does flesh refer to? Well, of course, flesh can refer to the physical nature of our bodies, the organs, the muscles, the tissues of our body. But in this context, Paul has in mind a more specific definition, because he's talking about that part of our flesh that desires things. And we have the advantage of knowing today where those desires are formed. They're formed in our brain. So our brain is flesh. It's made out of tissue. And it's that part of our flesh that forms desires. So when he's talking about the flesh that desires something, or the mind of the flesh, he's bringing up something about the brain and how the brain remembers things and brings things to our minds. The flesh, or the brain, forms desires. You take, for instance, when your stomach is empty. Your stomach sends messages, hormonal messages, to your brain, and your brain forms the desire to eat, to relieve your hunger. And there are many desires that we have that are formed in our brains that are really instinctive desires. Desires that protect us in some way, defend us in some way. Of course, we have the desire to eat, so we're protected from hunger, from not eating. One of the most powerful emotions we have is the emotion of fear. And it's produced by the brain to create the desire to deal with danger. Fear protects us from danger. Because fear is not a very agreeable, a very nice emotion to feel. We want to be relieved of fear. And so to do so, we escape danger, which causes fear. So for instance, fear can create the desire in us to run from danger, to escape it. Fear can create the desire in us to confront danger, deal with it, fight. And fear can also create in us the desire to simply resign ourselves to the danger, thinking that we can't do anything to resolve the fear. Shame is another human emotion that's related to fear. Our brains don't want to feel shame. It's a painful feeling. We want to escape it. We want to eliminate it. We are afraid of shame, and rightly so. So we want to avoid things that cause us shame. We understand that fear is a necessary emotion then because it protects us from danger. We avoid danger because we want to be relieved of the fear caused by things that are dangerous to us. So we learn to survive, we have to protect ourselves and defend ourselves, to alleviate fear and run from danger. But then something happens to us, something more extensive, more profound. What happens is this desire to survive causes fear to produce the desire to turn away and flee from anything that causes us a lack of comfort, disappointment, embarrassment, rejection, insecurity, or other kinds of emotional threats. Then this desire to survive and overcome whatever thing that causes us to be afraid turns into a priority to promote ourselves, to protect ourselves, to defend ourselves, even more than caring for and loving others. We don't want to feel afraid. And so fear causes us to desire to even protect ourselves and defend ourselves instead of loving. For example, if loving others unconditionally is going to cost me something and make me feel insecure because I have to sacrifice something, then because of the fear of insecurity, I may prefer rather to look after my own welfare and not love others. And so what has happened is this design of God's, his design in us to create something in us that was for our good, fear, to avoid danger, has turned into something now, by our own decisions, that promotes selfishness instead of love. So how do we set our minds on what the flesh desires? What's happened? Our brain has formed a mind that desires relief from any kind of fear by putting ourselves first and protecting ourselves above all. And two of the greatest fears we have are insecurity, the fear of insecurity, and the fear of unworthiness. In society around us, our community, our family, our friends, want to tell us stories about how to relieve these fears. The fear of insecurity, the fear of unworthiness, by selfish means, by acquiring things, by acquiring experiences, by having power over people, prestige and approval. And so, for instance, Our brains observe people who are happy because they have certain possessions that appear to make people happy. And so we decide to follow the story and want the same things and try to acquire the same things. It reminds us of the parable of the rich fool in Luke chapter 12 that we talked about earlier in an earlier study. He mistakenly thought that the value of a person's life, what makes him feel worthy, is acquiring possessions, an abundance of possessions. And so when he had a great harvest, an abundant harvest, he kept it all for himself instead of being generous and compassionate towards his servants. He deceived himself into thinking that it could take away any kind of insecurity or unworthiness. And in fact, if somebody doubted his value as a person, he could point them to his great harvest stored up in his barns and try to prove to them that he was worthy. That was his story. But we hear stories like this, and we accept them. We absorb them without questioning, without doubting them, and we try to make them our stories. The same thing that happens when we try to accumulate new experiences that are different. That, for instance, it reminds us of the lost son, again, because he was certain that being independent, experiencing independence from his father and life in the far country, experiencing things he had never experienced before, could bring him a sense of security and worthiness, because now he can make his own decisions and live life the way he wanted to live life. But he was mistaken, and it led to deep sadness. Well, we, though, hear stories of people doing this, and we accept the stories. We try to make them our own stories by just absorbing them and not questioning the validity of these stories. We might even observe somebody who tries to earn their worthiness by anger, because having anger with people, exploding in anger, is a way of controlling people and having power over them. So we unconsciously accept anger as a means for feeling powerful and feeling worthy or feeling secure in our anger. But it's deceitful, of course. But we just accept the story without thinking about it. We also observe people who criticize, condemn, judge, form prejudices, even practice racism. Why? To make themselves feel more worthy and more secure. They try to make themselves feel more worthy by criticizing or lowering the worthiness of other people. It doesn't make sense. But we may accept the story anyway, because we see it practiced, and we just absorb the story and make it our own story without questioning it, without doubting it. Furthermore, we open ourselves up to the messages of advertising or social media to permit ourselves to be convinced that the stories we hear there are stories that can help us feel worthy and secure in the very same ways. The result is a mind that is fashioned and formed by being fixed on what the flesh desires, selfish desires. It's what Paul described in Romans chapter 12, verse 2, as conforming ourselves to the world instead of transforming ourselves by the renewing of our minds. The result is a mind set on the flesh, on what the flesh desires, selfish ways of defending one's worth and defending one's sense of security. The result is an exaggerated, ugly, even monstrous version of the instinct that God created in us to alleviate fear by running from danger. How far has it gone? The problem is we don't stop and think about what we're thinking about. And instead, we just absorb the values of people around us and make those stories our stories, almost unconsciously. So what's the result of a mind ruled by the flesh? A mind ruled by the flesh is a mind ruled by selfishness, this selfish desire to defend and protect ourselves instead of loving others. And selfishness, Paul says in the passage, leads us to death. It leads us to spiritual death because selfishness cannot live alongside of God who is love. It also leads to a sort of emotional death because in selfishness we no longer pay attention to compassion, kindness, patience, forgiveness. We pay no attention to what other people are feeling, and we emotionally die. Also, it leads to a sort of social death because selfishness destroys our relationships. We think only of ourselves. So this is the mind that is governed by the flesh. It leads to death. It cannot submit itself to the law of God, Paul says. Which law is that? The law of love. Now, let's think about what the Spirit desires. Let's think about the mind that comes from the Spirit, that's according to the Spirit. First of all, who's he talking about here? When he talks about the Spirit, who's he referring to? Well, in a passage in Romans chapter 8, he's talking about the role of God's Spirit in our transformation. And in fact, in verse 9, for instance, he says, "You, however, are not in the realm of the flesh, but in the realm of the Spirit, if indeed the Spirit of God lives in you." So he's talking about the Spirit of God. The mind of the Spirit is the mind of God's Spirit. And what does the mind of God's Spirit desire? What does God's Spirit desire? He desires our transformation in the image of the Father. This is what he empowers us to do. In Galatians chapter 5, verse 22, for instance, Paul makes a list of love and its qualities as the fruit of the Spirit. He says, "But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Against such things there is no law." Then he says in verse 25, "Since we live by the Spirit, let us keep in step with the Spirit." So he's talking about God's Spirit and God's Spirit desire for our transformation in the image of our Heavenly Father, living in love. And in fact, when we were born again, we were born of the water and of the Spirit. God's Spirit began to live in us and empowers our spirit to love as the Father loves. So now, how can we set our minds on what the Spirit desires? Well, first of all, we're going to have to let go and stop believing the old stories. They're deceiving us. They're not true. It wasn't true for the rich fool. It wasn't true for the lost son. The stories we hear from people around us who try to advise us about how to protect ourselves and defend ourselves are the stories of selfishness. And they destroy us. They cause us lots of pain. Then we realize, too, after we let go of those stories, that we no longer have to defend ourselves. We no longer have to defend our worthiness. You know why? Because we have someone who defends us, the Father, who has immersed us in His grace. And by His grace, He has given us worthiness. He has made us worthy as His children. And because of that, we no longer have to worry about being worthy or about being insecure, because He's with us and He fills us with His presence. So now, instead of worrying about defending ourselves, we're free to love unconditionally. And if we focus our minds on loving unconditionally, as the Spirit desires, then we are going to experience the peace and the love and the life that comes from a mind that's fixed on what the Spirit desires. Now the next step would be to continue to read and study the teachings of Jesus with a very specific purpose in mind. Read about His conversations, His principles, His parables. Because what we need to do is store up new stories in our minds, to form a new mind by storing up new stories. And so we study, we learn from Jesus how to practice compassion, generosity, forgiveness, patience with people, mercy. And then as we practice, we walk with God's Spirit. Walk with Him practicing the fruit of the Spirit. And by practicing the manifestations of love in our life, by practicing compassion, by practicing forgiveness, what happens is we create new stories that now are our own stories. They belong to us because we are the ones who have lived those stories. When we practice compassion with somebody who's in need, or we forgive somebody who's offended us, or we're merciful to somebody who's judged us, and instead we're merciful to them, this becomes a story. Stories that we store up that bring us a sense of contentment and peace deep within us, knowing that we are close to the Father. And so by practicing this unconditional love, He takes away our fear. What results of having a mind that's fixed on what the Spirit desires? Not fear, but peace and life, true life, and the joy of transformation. So we've seen that we need to take seriously the project of renewing our minds, and one way we do that is by replacing the mind of the flesh with the mind of the Spirit, the mind of selfishness with the mind of transforming love. We're going to be talking some more next time about how these stories develop and what we can do about them. Until then, may God bless you.